The other
Okay,
one, YouTube last week.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yes, last week's.
Oh, yeah.
one, because I've watched it and, my daughter watches my YouTube videos, which is very, very sweet.
that really is.
Yeah. My daughter Hannah, I don't know how much. Like,
She sees you.
she sees me. Before that, like during the pandemic, when we were stuck at home, she'd watch the service then too. And up until I made a presentation, she was watching the baptism of Joanne's son over and over. It was very sweet. That
Oh,
was her
yeah.
favorite part.
Aww.
Yeah. Okay, so all right, welcome back to the Marvelous Mr. Matthew. This is part 4, the SOTM, which stands for Sermon on the Mount, of course. And I wanted to give it a subtitle, so I had to abbreviate it. So it's extending the Torah in a direction of mercy. So we did all of the Beatitudes last week. I was kind of shocked that we got through all of them. But really, it's only a tiny section of Matthew 5, and the Sermon on the Mount is Matthew 5 through 7. So there's a lot more to go. And so today it's extending the Torah in a direction of mercy, and that's really what the entire Sermon on the Mount is about. But today, in particular, we're looking at what have been called the antitheses. You have heard, but I say. And the main point to take away from that is that they're not antitheses at all. They're extensions. And the entire Sermon on the Mount, the entire gospel, the entire trajectory of history is an extension of the law laid down in Torah in a direction of mercy, in a direction of perfecting our love for neighbor and enemy, turning enemy into neighbor. So here's the Marvelous Mr. Matthew, part 4. And so we'll begin in prayer again. Okay, so the prayer of St. Francis summarizes the subversive spirit of the Sermon on the Summit. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it's in giving that we receive, and it's in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it's in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Amen.
So last week, I shared Dr. Amy Jill Levine's characterization of the Sermon of the Mount as the beginner's guide to the kingdom of heaven. I just think that's a brilliant way to put it. The Sermon on the Mount is the beginner's guide to the kingdom of heaven, not the guide on how to get there, but on how to turn this world into the kingdom of heaven. So it's the beginner's blueprint for building heaven on earth. And the Beatitudes or blessings declare who the builders are. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn. It's saying these are the people who are building the kingdom of heaven among us right now. Not the people who just go to heaven. And I am a universal salvationist, so I believe that everybody goes to heaven. But the people who bring heaven to earth for everyone. Everyone gets to participate in the kingdom that we are called to build together. Every beatitude is a blessing, not just to the poor in spirit, not just to the meek, but a blessing through. So last week I was I was talking about how the Sermon on the Mount made allusions back to the Hebrew scriptures. And I feel like all the Beatitudes are an allusion to God's original blessing to Abraham when God said, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So just like God's original blessing to Abraham, the Beatitudes or blessings are to be blessings for the whole world. So lest we try to distance ourselves from these subversive blessings, because these blessings can feel like curses. They're blessings on people who mourn, people who are poor in spirit, people who are downtrodden. And Luke directly blesses the poor, and poverty doesn't feel like a blessing. And we might want to distance ourselves and say, oh, it's wonderful that these people over here are bringing heaven to earth. I don't have to participate in that. I can just enjoy it. No, Jesus is, of course, speaking to the to at least 4 disciples and the crowds beyond that, but he's also speaking directly to us. And the final beatitude again is, "Blessed are you." So we are called to live into the blessings of poverty of spirit, meekness, mercy, and all of the 9 beatitudes. And he goes on to say, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you." So those are blessings we might want to avoid. We don't want to be insulted. We don't want to be persecuted. But when we are, for the sake of building heaven on earth, we are blessed. We are experiencing the birth pangs of a new world. So after the Beatitudes, there is a section on salt, light, and law. And this is again Jesus telling us not to run away from who we are meant to be. Speaking to anyone with ears to hear and listen, and that should be us, since we're studying this together. So it reinforces our responsibility to be blessings to the world. Jesus says, if salt has lost its saltiness, what happens when we turn our blessings into curses? What happens when we use the law or religion or faith as a weapon of condemnation against others? And that's kind of what happens when we use religion as a cudgel or a weapon to say, look how faithful I am. And by extension, look how wrong you are, which of course has been done throughout history. And that would be salt drawing attention to itself, which of course, when things are oversalted, they become disgusting and unhealthy. Whereas when salt is used correctly, when salt is used in moderation, to the best of its purposes, it can be useful as a preservative and as a flavor enhancer. So salt and light are blessings to others. Flavor enhancers and illuminators point away from themselves. So we're not called to self-glorification, but to magnify love. We're called to point to love, to enhance love, to share love. And I come to that at the end of this presentation too, because that theme is, Jesus returns to that theme over and over throughout the Sermon on the Mount. So do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. Jesus makes it clear that his words are about living into the fullness of our vocation as children of God. They show that God's authority is fulfilled in meekness, mercy, peacemaking, hunger for thirst and justice. Basically, God's will is fulfilled in living into the Beatitudes or blessings. And this should dispel any ideas about the words being a refutation or correction of what has come before. They're perfect or most merciful. What I mean by perfect is most merciful interpretation of Torah. So Jesus's words are to guide us to use everything that has come before and, make sure that all that we do makes the world that comes after us a more merciful place. There's a way to interpret not just Torah, but also gospel as a weapon, as a source of condemnation. And Jesus is telling us not to do that.
And today's readings will be disobedience and that lead to a lot of supersessionism.
Oh,
It's Moses striking a rock. And now I forget what the reading for today, but they're in here, of course.
yeah, I didn't pick up a bulletin.
I have.
Thank you. It says draw church on the front. That's cool. I will have to give this to
I
my
have it
artist.
I have it
friend.
open to you, but the lessons, of course, are up to the front.
Yeah, I usually do see at least what the lessons are, and I have not done that this week. So I am behind. Yeah. It would be very interesting to connect all of this back to today's lessons. And of course we could, but I would have to take more time to think about them. But of course, the Sermon on the Mount, like I said last week, that's the signature story of Matthew. And it does connect to at least everything in the gospel. So this salt, light, and law, and saying, live into who you are meant to be. And who you are meant to be is fulfillers of the law, just like I am showing you that I am fulfilling the law, not denying it, not correcting it. So this leads perfectly into the extensions that make up the rest of the chapter. So extending the meaning of Torah in a direction of mercy, which I will say is the direction that the Torah should go in the first place. It's not like changing the direction, it's extending it. If the 9 Beatitudes are the who's building the kingdom of heaven, then the 6 extensions are the how do we do this? And Jesus gives very, very practical instruction. So each extension ups the ante. The standards are not changed, they're just heightened. And they're at their highest because with love, all things are possible. So these are not impossible standards. They're just very, very, very high. The extensions build a fence around Torah, which is an expression from Rabbinic Judaism that, of course, Dr. Amy Jo Levine taught me. I learned from her. Essentially means protecting the law by creating the conditions that keep us from violating it, so that we don't, if we are moving in a direction that could lead to violating the law, this should keep us from doing that. And it could look like extra laws preemptively preventing us from breaking the ultimate law. I think a better way of seeing it is just setting ourselves on a different foundation entirely. I think that's what it's meant to do. Not extra punishments, not extra consequences, but just setting our footing on a new foundation, so that the temptations leading in the direction of violating the law aren't even there. Does this make sense? I
Yeah.
should pause and make sure I'm making sense. Okay. So the punishments for failing to live up to these standards are not inflicted by God, but by us. I think that's so crucial because Jesus is about to say things like, Jesus is about to say things such as, when you call someone a fool, you're in danger of the hell of fire, and it's better to lose your limbs than be cast into hell. Jesus is about to talk about hell a lot. So before we get to that, I really want to say that the hell Jesus describes is not a punishment from God. It's what we do to each other. And Jesus is talking about the natural consequences of living in anger or living in lust. The natural way that breaks down human relationships to the point that we hurt and condemn each other. And the hell that he speaks of, Gehenna, was the place where it was the place where refuse was burnt, and it was also a place of human sacrifice in the time preceding Jesus. So he's saying when you live in this way, you are sacrificing each other to the angry divinity who is not God, but yourselves. You are killing each other. You're not honoring God by doing that. You're satisfying your own sense of anger when you sacrifice others, but that's not what God is about. So the hell of which, okay, I just finished explaining that. So the systemic violence, the systemic hatred, dehumanization, violence are what keep the fires of hell burning. And anger, which leads to violence, enmity that leads to hate. Those are the fuel for the fire. All these things that Jesus talk about, anger, lust, retaliation, run a natural course of escalation and violence, and safeguarding against them puts us on a trajectory of mercy. So, from do not murder to don't be angry. I know this is hard to read on the screen. It's also in here. And I just put it so that I wouldn't have to look for it, so I could see it clearly. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, or which is an insult, is answerable to the court, and anyone who says you fool will be in danger of the fire of hell. So the first person rebuked for committing murder was Cain, but God did not put Cain to death. He put a sign on Cain, warning of sevenfold vengeance. But Cain was also isolated. He was ostracized. There was consequence, but God wanted to prevent others from killing him. And so that whole story is about how anger easily escalates into violence, and violence easily escalates into all-out war. So from after Cain comes Lamech, who he boasts about killing someone for insulting him, and he says if Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech is avenged 77 times. And then after that, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump away to a flood that drowns the whole world. And that flood that's a representation of human violence being all-consuming. So how do we quell anger? How do we temper the anger inside of us and transform it and dissipate it? To stave off anger against us, Jesus tells us to settle matters quickly, postpone worship to reconcile with someone. And this tells me that we're not right with God when we're not right with each other. God still loves us, but we're not reflecting that love. So, I mean, it says postpone worship to reconcile, but we could also think that reconciliation is a form of worship, and probably the more urgent form of worship if we're in a conflict. So Jesus says your adversary may hand you over to the judge, who may throw you in prison. And from this line, we can know that the consequences that flow from anger are not God-driven, but human-driven. I mean, Jesus even says in here, you know, he says, the judge may hand you over to the officer and you may be thrown into prison. You will not get out till you have paid the last penny. So if you're in debt and someone's angry with you because you're not paying off your debt, then that's all human driven. And Jesus is giving very practical advice for avoiding all of that. So to curb our own anger, we go back to the Beatitudes. Be meek, have humility, have enough self-awareness to recognize our own shortcomings, because when we can recognize our own imperfections, then we're more able to forgive them in others. And with the recognition of our own imperfections should also come with the assurance that we're forgiven, which should help us forgive others. Because when we know our imperfections, but we don't know we're forgiven, that can lead us on a path of self-deprecation and self-hatred, which makes hating others a lot easier when we hate ourselves. So I'll pause here to see if there are any thoughts or additions or challenges to what I've said. The next extension. So, warning against lust, objectification, and self-mutilation. There's the fire that it could all lead to. So, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Jesus is talking primarily to men, but I think it can apply to women too. More broadly, us, all of us, to gouge out our eyes rather than condemn someone for being an object of our lust or temptation. So anytime you see someone punished or ridiculed or berated for dressing inappropriately, which falls disproportionately onto women. You know, Jesus didn't scold women for what they wore. He told men to gouge out their eyes instead. That's very, I mean, that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek takeaway, but it's worth thinking about, though. Jesus is not advocating self-mutilation, but he is highlighting the severity of objectifying, exploiting, or using someone for their body. And he's, you know, if you reduce someone to their body and, you know, lust after someone in a dehumanizing, I want you for your body kind of way, you know, what Jesus says, which directly concerns harm to the body, should get you to thinking, ouch, no, I don't want to do this to others, and I don't want this to happen to me. It's interesting to go back to Leviticus, here in Leviticus 21:16 through 21. Being unblemished is a prerequisite for offering sacrifice to God or coming to the altar and offering anything to God. Self-mutilation would make you unworthy to approach God, perhaps be a physical sign of a moral defect, or maybe it was probably thought of that way. Now Jesus says it serves God to guard against objectifying others, even to such an extreme degree as to, you know, I mean,
Yes,
it's,
it
yeah,
would make you an improper offering.
Yeah.
So you really do.
yeah. Jesus is saying, you know, you think you can't approach God if you are physically deformed, or if you have a physical imperfection. But I'm telling you, it's better to make yourself physically imperfect than to objectify or lust after someone else. And wanting someone for their body, I mean, we think first of sexual connotations, but we could also think of any kind of labor that requires the body. So any kind of objectification that requires, you know, I think of slave labor in the same way. And of course, slavery included sexual abuse too, but any kind of physical abuse, anytime you're dehumanizing someone to use that person as a commodity, as a tool for your own ends, you know, I think this could be extended to any form of doing that. Is Jesus suggesting that hell is a punishment for lust? Not in the way we might think, not as in God will do this to us. The pain, anguish, hurt, and in some cases even bloodshed that comes from breaking up relationships, or objectifying and commodifying people, or any kind of dehumanization can lead to hell. And I mean, it reminded me of the hell that resulted from Paris kidnapping Helen of Sparta and launching the Trojan War. My child just read about that, and you know, just recently studied the mythology behind all that. And it's amazing how, you know, breaking up one relationship led to so much death and destruction. But I think that whole story can be a metaphor for the same kind of message. Again, just really want to emphasize hell is what we put ourselves and each other through. It's not God's condemnation of us. It's what we do to each other. So I'm not saying it's not real. It's definitely real, but it's not a punishment from God. So Jesus's warnings are real, but they shouldn't lead us to think of God in a very punishing, angry, I'm going to hurt you kind of way, because that's not who God is. And everything is trying to teach us that that's not who God is. We keep ourselves from stumbling into the hell of jealousy and exploitation through self-control and through being more ready to suffer than inflict suffering on others. Not a glorification of suffering, just the thought of hurting others becomes even more disgusting to us than getting hurt. So, warning against divorce. Are all marriages made in heaven? This is a really hard one because it's one that we could be more likely than some of these others to actually encounter in our personal lives. It has been said that anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. I'm reading directly from this text on Matthew, this is the NIV, or
It's NIV.
this is NIV. So I'm used to the NRSV, and sometimes the differences between different versions make a really big difference. Other versions say anyone who divorces his wife causes her to commit adultery, whereas the text I was reading from says makes her a victim of adultery. Of course, those are very different things, and I don't know what to make of the other texts, except that I like our booklet's version more as far as that's concerned. At least our booklet is more fair. What you do to someone should not be the cause, you know, of their own sin. It may cause her to need to remarry, and then that would possibly to be defined as adultery, but it just doesn't seem fair, and I don't want to take this time now to think through what all of that might mean, even though we should probably think through that later. So despite popular belief, Amy Jill Levine again tells us this is not about making sure women are protected and not discarded onto the streets. And that's a way that that's the way I've explained it in the past. That's the way I've heard it explained. That makes it sound like a good thing, like Jesus is cautioning against divorce in order to protect women. But the Ketubah, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but the marriage contract already protected the woman. So there was a marriage contract. It had provisions for protecting the woman. And a lot of people would probably think that a monetary compensation would be better than actually living with someone who wants to divorce you. That living with someone who wants to divorce you isn't necessarily the best protection. So
we also know from Paul's community that some women were in business for themselves and had resources.
yes, but yeah,
In that Jewish community. I don't know
Yeah.
what else the historians know about it.
absolutely. I mean, there are, and that reiterates the point that's being made here, that when we use this to say life was unfair under Judaism, this is a Christian improvement to protect women, which is the conclusion that a lot of people might go to. That's unfair, and that comes from a misunderstanding or very limited understanding of Judaism. It's important to know that women were not only cared for, but had enough rights to and autonomy to make a living. Of course, that varied as it still does today. And of course, there were vulnerable people more and less vulnerable throughout time. And the Roman occupation could have changed a lot of things too. So, but it's not fair to use this as a way of saying Judaism was behind. Jesus is still talking within Judaism. So it's not necessarily about protecting the woman. This is about keeping the commitment of marriage through all the struggles and frustrations and sickness and health, wealth or poverty, the traditional vows. Marriage epitomizes human commitment and should not be easily discarded. What does Matthew mean by accepting cases of sexual immorality? Again, Dr. Levine points out that the Greek porneia doesn't necessarily mean sexual immorality. Well, that's how it's translated today, and of course, that's what we derive from that word when we think of the derivatives that come from it. But Amy Jill Levine says it's vague and it can mean different things. So maybe Matthew's just saying except in egregious cases. And so what are some of those egregious cases? Perhaps into this category, Amy Jill Levine writes, into this category falls not only infidelity, but also desertion, spousal abuse, loss of affection, coming to terms with a person's sexuality or gender identity, various forms of addiction, and so on. So Amy Jill Levine talks about all these other reasons why divorce may actually be the most loving or necessary option. Jesus wants us to take marriage very, very seriously, but I don't think Jesus wants us to stay trapped in a marriage that's dangerous to our physical or mental health. what God has joined together. So God is love. Take care to honor what love brings together. But what if the relationship wasn't initiated in love? What if it was initiated out of manipulation or fear or oppression or all these other ways that humans relate to each other in less than loving ways? And what if the most loving thing is letting go? And the point is to take marriage and relationship commitment seriously. The point is not to condemn divorcees. And of course, this verse has been used as a weapon against people who are divorced. And whenever we weaponize scripture, we're doing it wrong. So the next extension is saying, from not breaking oaths to not swearing oaths. It's all about deepening your integrity. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill it. I think I missed a word there. Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Just be honest. Live so that your integrity is not in doubt. Jesus says very specifically, don't swear by heaven. Don't involve God in a hierarchy of truthfulness whereby you're effectively saying, you can trust me this time. This time I really mean it. I'm swearing an oath. If your words mean what they mean, then that becomes unnecessary. And I was also thinking, when we swear oaths in court, when a witness swears an oath, that's to show that you know that there's a consequence to lying. So you swear in court to say, I know that if I am caught lying, I could be punished for it. I could receive consequences. What if we lived in such a world where we didn't have to remind each other of consequences for lying because we were just honest anyway? Don't swear by your head. Have the humility to recognize that most things are not under your control. So don't swear by God. Don't swear by yourself, because you've got to realize that even you might have some control over your actions, but even that's not entirely in your control. So does everyone know what the Arabic word inshallah means?
Don't we just say it means peace be with you? Or is that?
That's salam alaikum.
Oh.
But inshallah, there are so many words that have the name of God built into it that mean beautiful things. Arabic is a beautiful language. So the word inshallah, God willing, is a wonderful Arabic phrase that can help us guard against making promises we can't keep. So anytime we say, I'll be there, inshallah, that means I'm coming, God willing. It means I'm going to do my utmost to be there. But if I'm not there, then it was out of my control. We shouldn't abuse this phrase to keep us out of obligations we don't want to fulfill. So we shouldn't say, oh yeah, I'm coming, inshallah, and then just completely skip out and oh, it must not have been God's will. That's why I wasn't there. I mean, as long as we don't abuse it, I think that word is a good word to incorporate into our vocabulary. So,
Well, don't you use God willing when you say to somebody, make a commitment? Maybe it's because I was raised by nuns. So.
that's a great thing to say. You don't have to say it in Arabic. I find, yeah, absolutely. I don't always, but I should. And I have a history with Islam that I'll go into later, but I just found it a natural part of my Muslim friends' vocabulary. And it became more easy for me to incorporate that word than even God willing, just because it was built in. And that's
well, actually, in my family, we say God willing and the creek don't rise. So
I love that. I don't know what that means, but I love
We were talking about how God's law is expressed through nature. We live in a natural world
Yeah,
created by God and things happen in it.
yeah,
But I'm also
if the creek
reminded-
rises, you can't, if the creek is between you and where you're going, you can't
Gotcha.
get there. And so I
no, I love that, and everything you both said makes
In
sense.
my family, there was a doctor whose patient once said to him, well, thanks if it works.
I mean, and that's kind of that's the other side of it too. So I think this extension is all about building a foundation of honesty and trust that is crucial to building God's kingdom on earth. How can we take care of each other? How can we depend on each other if we can't fully trust each other? So doing away with oaths altogether. And of course, the picture is somebody swearing on a Bible, which is just very ironic given this extension.
didn't Cain swear an oath? And he said he didn't know where his brother was. Wasn't that like the first problem, Cain and Abel?
That was certainly the first problem. Was that an oath?
Well, that's why I'm asking. I thought that has been taught to me in part, that was part of his penalty was because he told a lie. He didn't, and I don't know that he swore by it because it was only under Abraham that we had people swearing.
Hmm.
But he said, I don't know, I don't know where he is.
Well, if that's
And then is he the I am my brother's keeper?
yes, that I do know.
Yeah.
He said that, and I do not know is definitely a lie, whether it was specifically an oath. Well, if he's talking to God, it could be an oath by definition. I mean, God was the recipient, so I mean, I think that makes sense that's an introduction of dishonesty into the world after murder, which is also a bad thing. And so the whole point is to be honest. And when you're honest, you don't need to have different levels of honesty. It's just honesty. So refusing retaliation, reclaiming dignity. There's an eye for an eye. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. So different versions of this, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. So the law is designed to prevent escalation of violence by limiting retaliation to you can't do more to you than what was done to you. And it also affirms that all lives are equal so that a stronger person may not harm a more vulnerable person with impunity. The Romans also had this law, lex talionis. But the law of equals, the Romans had a lot of, this is, if you do this to a commoner, if you do this to a senator, if you do this to, they had a law among unequals too. And Judaism didn't have that, here's what you may do to a more vulnerable person, here's a bigger penalty if the person has a higher status. It didn't have that because everyone is equal, because we're all made in the divine image. Now, that doesn't mean that people didn't violate that and harm each other and do more to them than what was done to them. Violence escalates rather naturally. It's also not to be interpreted literally. It usually does mean a fine instead of physical mutilation. Again, Amy Jill Levine is my source for this. So if anyone hears, oh, that's so brutal, even if it is limiting violence, it's still so brutal to say an eye for an eye. Well, it's a brutal phrase. It is a brutal phrase, but that was not the practice. The practice was a fine. And it's meant to compensate in proportion to the offense, in proportion to the physical harm and the humiliation and the injury, and the loss of ability. It's meant to compensate for all of that. And you could say that there's nothing that can really compensate for that, which is true. You can't get your vision back if someone takes your eye. But it's meant to be the best possible way of ensuring justice. And Jesus takes us a step in a merciful direction beyond that. But each offense in Jesus's examples do not assume that the parties involved are recognized as equals. Every single thing Jesus is saying is not just an injury, but an insult. And Jesus is speaking of burdens that Roman occupiers would impose on Jewish people. And they could also be performed by Jews against other Jews. They could, but they were also specifically things that Romans would do to Jewish people. They were all insults as well as injuries. And they're not only about refusing violent retaliation, but responding to insult in a way that reclaims human dignity and proclaims equality. So I'll go into the specifics. Walter Wink, brilliant theologian, and one of the more well-known theologians. He wrote a series on the powers and then a summary of the series in The Powers That Be. And that's where I'm getting some of what I'm about to say. He writes that the word that's translated as resist is a term for warfare. And Jesus does want us to resist evil, but non-violently. So the word for resist, Jesus would say, don't violently oppose your enemies. But he doesn't want us to submit to evil either. And he tells us exactly how not to submit to evil. So to turn the other cheek, to slap someone on the right cheek with the right hand is to give a backhanded slap. And the message from it is that you are my inferior. By turning the other cheek, you say, I am your equal. And it doesn't perpetuate violence. It gives pause, space, and room for the spirit, room to breathe, room for the spirit. Hand over your coat as well. Jesus speaks of an unjust economic system that came from occupation, as Roman taxes drove people into debt and off of their land. To hand over your coat, if you're suing someone for their coat, that only happened to the poorest of the poor. You would sue someone for money or land or something else that's worth more than a coat if you could. You're asking someone who's already in the depths of poverty to hand over what little they have. So to hand over your coat as well, when someone sues you for your shirt, it lays bare the system of injustice that literally takes everything. And when you fulfill this literally, you become naked. And as Walter Wink explains, nakedness was taboo in Judaism. It fell less on the naked party than on the person viewing or causing the nakedness. So that reminds us of the story of, I think it's when Ham sees Noah naked, he sees him. The other brothers don't look, but kind of back up and cover their naked father so they don't see. But there are problems with this whole story. The biggest of which is a whole system of systemic racism traced to Ham, which is kind of unfair because presumably he was the same color as his father and brothers. But that whole story does show that viewing nakedness was considered more taboo than actually being naked. And certainly causing nakedness, robbing someone of their clothing should be more shameful than actually being naked. And Walter Wink goes on to describe how in apartheid South Africa, one of the last actions before apartheid was overturned was a bunch of women stripping in front of the bulldozers and scaring them away. And that was, you know, it sounds kind of funny, but that's a real, like, look at what you're doing to us. Look at this injustice. It sounds kind of humorous, but it's also very shameful. And they were,
No,
Yeah.
I wasn't laughing that it was
Yeah.
funny. I was laughing at that. It was a masterful,
exactly, it is.
yeah.
It is, absolutely. So these are all very subversive instructions. They're not telling you to just sit back and take abuse. They are talking about ways to confront your abuser that are nonviolent, but still very, very, very powerful. Go with them 2 miles. Roman soldiers could conscript civilians to carry their packs, or the most famous Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross, only for a mile at a time. Armies on the move without modern transportation and tanks, they'd get tired. So they could conscript civilians, but limiting the conscription to 1 mile probably helped to guard against revolt. So you didn't want to violate the military code by making a civilian go further. So imagine someone makes you carry something, but instead of putting it down when you've carried it far enough, you keep going. You get them running after you saying, "Hey, give it back." You know, that's kind of a funny image to me. But again, it's taking agency, showing your equality, and everything Jesus instructs has the effect of reclaiming agency while causing real frustration and shame, but not physical harm to the oppressor. And the whole point is to overturn the unjust system. I refuse to live by your rules. The actions Jesus advises proclaim this directly to the Roman occupiers, but more broadly, we're instructed to refuse the expectations of a violent, retaliatory world. So perfection lies in loving everyone. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. And then at the end of this extension, Jesus says, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Or does Jesus say that? We'll come to that. So hate your enemies is nowhere in the Torah. In fact, Dr. Levine points out scripture anticipates the command to love our enemies. Proverbs, for example, do not rejoice when your enemies fall. Do not let your heart be glad when they stumble. Is this just another way of saying don't stoop to their level, or is there something more? How often do we interpret love for our friends as hatred of those who oppose them? How often do we think the enemy of my enemy is my friend? How often does working for justice sort of translate into hating people perpetuating injustice, and beyond hating the injustice itself? So what if we recognize that our fate is bound to the fate of everyone, including our enemies? And that's suggested in Jeremiah 21:7, where it says, seek the welfare of the nation, that if you're sent into exile, or if others come and claim you, seek the welfare, because your welfare is bound up in it. So this verse calls us to recognize our interconnection even with those who oppose us. Alliances over and against others break down and lead to conflicts that can destroy the world. We need a firmer foundation. We need a firmer foundation to build community upon. Jesus says, pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. we're all children of the same parent. When we recognize that our enemies are children of the same parent too, all made in the image of love. And we recognize that all rivalry is sibling rivalry. All rivalry is sibling rivalry. Sibling rivalry is still serious and still painful. But in the end, these are still our brothers and sisters and siblings. Be perfect is better translated as you will be perfect. The verb is future tense. We are perfected when our love is limitless. So Jesus is not going through a whole bunch of instructions and then at the end just saying be perfect in a flippant way as if, well, of course that's impossible and everything I've just said is impossible. Jesus is not saying that. Jesus is just like the last beatitude was, blessed are you when. This is another, you will be perfect. You will be perfect and perfected when you live into the fullness of love. It's not impossible. It's our destiny. It's the future we were made for because we're made in the image of love. That last thing is just to credit the image. So that was all Matthew 5. And there are 2 more chapters in the Sermon on the Mount. So I wanted to try to get through a little bit of Matthew 6 today, but more on Matthew 6 and 7 next week. So Matthew 6, nurturing our connection to love. If Matthew 5 is all about what living under the authority of love looks like in public, or all about instructions on how we are to live and live among others and how we are to treat others. Matthew 6 is about nurturing our connection to love in private and making sure that our inward hearts reflect our outward practices. So Dr. Cornell West said, justice is what love looks like in public. Tenderness is what love looks like in private. I know Dr. Cornell West has said that. I do not know if he's quoting someone else. He might be. So Matthew 6 is about nurturing an intimate connection with love, the source of our being, our parent, our father. So we prioritize love when we keep a healthy connection to love. This is like how exercise and self-care, this is like our spiritual exercise and self-care. It is crucial to being our most helpful selves out in the world. We have to do the inward work in order to be able to do any of the outward work. So Jesus nurtured his connection to love, which infused his entire being. He was love, he embodied love, but he nurtured that frequently when he went alone to pray. And Matthew 6 is all about it's really all about nurturing our heart to be able to shine love out to the world more brightly, more beautifully. So prioritizing love over self-glorification. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. There's no contradiction between this verse and the verses about salt and light. You know, when Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world, let your light shine. Yes, let your light shine, but not onto yourself, onto the bigger picture. It's natural to crave recognition, honor and status. There should be another comma there. Even when we give to help others, we wish to be recognized for our giving, and that's human and natural. But when we wish to be seen as over and above or over and against, we do not yet fully recognize the depth of our interconnection. To prioritize recognition and self-glory is often to receive it. If that's what we seek, we will find it. Jesus says, those who practice their piety to be seen by others have received their reward in full. Yes, others can see them. And some will admire them, some will hate them, but some will admire them for as righteous as they are. But then that's our full reward. When that's what we most desire and that's what we get, then that's what we get. It keeps our eyes off of something better. When we can give for the sake of others without regard to recognition. And when we can receive in true gratitude, not thinking, oh, I just got a gift, I have to one up that. We will understand just how intimately our welfare is tied to the welfare of our fellow human beings. And the joy that comes from building a new world, building heaven and on earth together, in and through love. That joy is the reward. It's a joy that it's a reward that we take part in building, and it's given to us from love. I mean, it's the reward of living in the love that we're made in. And it's bigger than being recognized. Finding true joy in a world where everyone just loves and serves each other because that's what we do. And I don't think we're really there yet, but I'd like to think we're living for that. I mean, when I'm with my closest friends, I'm not thinking about how to impress them. But when I'm by myself, I am often thinking of what can I do to make myself impressive. And it's just the way that fades away when you're among people that you know and love. It's just beautiful how the desire for self-recognition or importance just fades away, and you don't miss it. You don't even think about it because you're surrounded by love. And I think creating a world where we're always surrounded by that love, that's the reward that Jesus speaks of, that we can't get if we're focusing on what others think about us.
And that has to do with children in their infancy and youth needing to live in a world of love. They need to be loved.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It really needs to come from the very beginning. And if it doesn't, you're going through a lifetime of trying to heal a trauma. Yeah. So I think this is what it means to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, which is toward the end of Matthew 6. When we're building a world in which we all love each other and we're all just naturally caring for each other, then the needs that we're anxious about are already met anyway. We're doing what we can and receiving from others what we can't do, but it's okay that we can't do it because we're receiving from others. We're not thinking about the give and take of it all. We're just living in joy. And then I talk about the Lord's Prayer, but I don't think we have time for that. I can just add that on to my next week's presentation and then go through Matthew 7. So, Laura, thank you for.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. This was wonderful. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
I'm going to
thank
go
you
ahead
all.
and end YouTube now. Thanks for joining us, YouTube.